What if everything you experience, your thoughts, your fears, even your identity, is being shaped by patterns you didn't choose and can't see? Carl Jung referred to these patterns as archetypes. However, when most people hear the word archetype, they think of characters, the hero, the villain, the mentor. But in Jungian psychology, as developed by Carl Jung, archetypes are not characters, not images, and not symbols in themselves. They are structuring patterns of the psyche, formless principles that shape how experience is organized from the very beginning. An archetype is not something you see directly. It is something that determines how what you see takes form. It does not give you a fixed image. It gives your psyche the capacity to generate certain kinds of experiences. The images you recognize, the hero, the mother, the shadow, are expressions of these deeper patterns interacting with your personal life, your memory, and your environment. To understand this more clearly, it helps to shift into an analogy. Imagine the psyche as an ocean. At the surface of this ocean, there are visible formations, movements that seem stable enough to recognize. One of these is like a whirlpool. This whirlpool represents the ego. It has a center. It has a shape. It gathers movement into a point that feels like I. From the perspective of the whirlpool, everything appears to revolve around it, and it experiences itself as the center of activity. But the whirlpool does not create itself. It is formed and continuously shaped by currents moving through the ocean. These currents are not random. They follow deeper patterns, movements that organize how energy flows, how pressure builds, and how visible structures emerge. These deeper patterns are what we are calling archetypes. Archetypes, in this sense, are like the patterns of movement the ocean itself can take. They are not the water, and they are not the visible shapes on the surface. They are the underlying ways in which movement organizes itself, how currents form, how they interact, and how they shape everything that appears at the surface. Libido, psychic energy, flows through these patterns. Depending on how that energy moves, the whirlpool at the surface changes. Sometimes it becomes more intense, more focused, pulled into a strong directional movement. Other times it becomes calmer, less defined, or influenced by multiple currents at once. But at no point is the whirlpool independent of the deeper movement. Its shape, its intensity, and its direction are always being influenced by patterns beneath it. In the same way, the ego does not exist independently of archetypes. It is structured through them. At any given moment, your experience, what you notice, what feels important, how you interpret reality, is shaped by the patterns through which psychic energy is flowing. This is why archetypes are not optional features of the psyche. They are not things you use or activate. They are the underlying structure through which the psyche organizes meaning, perception, and development. You do not step outside of them. You do not choose them in a conscious sense. You move through them. And just like the ocean can take on different patterns of movement, storms, currents, and tides, the psyche can organize itself through different archetypal patterns. The hero is one of these patterns. The shadow is another. The mother, the trickster, the self, each represents a different way that psychic energy can organize experience. What you consciously see, the images, the thoughts, the stories you tell yourself, are like the surface expressions of this deeper movement. They are real, but they are not the source. The source lies in the patterns that shape how those expressions come into being. This is why the same themes appear across cultures and across time. The details change, but the structure remains. A hero in one culture may be a warrior, in another a god, and in another an ordinary person, but the pattern of struggle, confrontation, and transformation remains consistent because it reflects a fundamental way the psyche organizes development. Archetypes are not characters you become. They are not symbols you memorize. They are the invisible patterns that shape how experience unfolds, how meaning forms, and how the ego itself is structured. You do not choose them. You move through them. One of the most notable of the archetypes is what Jung referred to as the hero archetype. The hero archetype is one of the most fundamental structuring patterns of the psyche, but it is often misunderstood as simply being brave or overcoming challenges. That is a surface-level interpretation, something closer to storytelling than psychology. At a deeper level, the hero is not about bravery in the ordinary sense. It is about movement, a specific kind of psychological movement through which the psyche differentiates, confronts resistance, and develops a center of identity. The hero is not a person. It is not a character you become or a role you consciously choose. It is a pattern of experience, a way the psyche organizes itself when it is pushed toward growth, whenever there is a sense of, "I have to face this. I can't avoid this anymore. I need to become something more than I am now." The hero archetype is active. This pattern always involves tension. The hero does not emerge in comfort. It appears at the edge of what is known, where something unfamiliar, difficult, or overwhelming must be confronted. It is the structure that organizes the experience of stepping beyond what is already established, beyond safety, beyond dependence, beyond passive existence. This is why hero stories across cultures share the same structure, even when the details are completely different. The hero leaves the familiar world, enters a space of difficulty or danger, faces something that exceeds their current capacity, and returns transformed. In one culture, this may be a warrior entering battle. In another, it may be a figure descending into the underworld. In another, it may be an ordinary person confronting internal conflict. The imagery changes, but the pattern remains identical. These stories are not just entertainment or coincidence. They are symbolic representations of a psychological process that occurs within every individual. The journey is not only external, it is the psyche moving through a structured process of development. The enemy or obstacle is not only something outside, it often represents something not yet integrated within the individual. And the return is not just victory, it is transformation, a shift in the structure of identity itself. At its core, the hero archetype organizes the experience of differentiation. It is the pattern through which the psyche separates from what is given, whether that is dependency, passivity, or unconscious identification, and establishes a more defined sense of self. It introduces direction, effort, and confrontation into the system. Without it, there would be no movement toward autonomy, no capacity to face difficulty, and no development of identity. This is why the hero is closely tied to the emergence of the ego, though it is not the ego itself. The hero provides the pattern of movement through which the ego becomes stronger, more defined, and more capable of engaging with reality. It organizes experiences into challenges to be faced, obstacles to be overcome, and paths to be followed. But it is important to understand that the hero is not always experienced as something positive. From within the psyche, it often feels like pressure, like being pushed into something uncomfortable or unavoidable. It can feel like fear mixed with necessity, like something in you knows you have to move forward, even if you don't fully understand why. This is because the hero is not concerned with comfort, it is concerned with development. It pulls the psyche out of stagnation and into movement. It disrupts what is stable but limiting. It forces confrontation with what has been avoided. And through that confrontation, it allows something new to emerge. Seen this way, the hero archetype is not about becoming a hero in the conventional sense. It is about participating in a pattern of transformation that is built into the structure of the psyche itself. It is the way the psyche grows, the way it defines itself, and the way it moves from what is already known into what is not yet realized. The hero is not who you are. It is the pattern through which you become. However, to understand the hero fully, you have to understand its relationship to the ego, because the hero is not separate from the ego's development. It is the pattern through which the ego comes into existence and strengthens over time. In Jungian psychology, as developed by Carl Jung, the ego is not arrogance or pride. It is not a negative trait. The ego is simply the center of conscious awareness, the part of you that experiences I. It is your sense of identity, your awareness, your ability to say this is me and distinguish yourself from everything else. But this sense of I is not fully formed at birth. It is not something you are simply given. It is something that must develop, stabilize, and differentiate over time. Early in life, the individual exists in a relatively undifferentiated state. There is not yet a strong boundary between self and world, between internal and external. The child does not fully experience itself as a separate, autonomous center. Instead, experience is more fluid, less structured, and less defined. For the ego to emerge, something has to happen. The psyche must begin to separate, define, and establish itself in relation to what is not itself. This is where the hero archetype becomes essential. The hero provides the structural pattern for differentiation. It organizes the process through which the individual moves from dependence toward independence, from fusion with the environment toward a distinct sense of identity. This does not happen passively. It happens through encountering resistance. Every time a child faces something difficult, attempts something beyond their current ability, acts independently instead of relying entirely on others, or asserts, "I can do this," in the face of uncertainty, the hero pattern is operating. These moments may seem small on the surface, but structurally they are profound. Each one is a micro-confrontation with the unknown. The child encounters something that is not yet integrated, something unfamiliar, challenging, or outside their current capacity, and through engaging with it, the ego becomes more defined. The ego does not form in isolation. It forms through contrast and resistance. It becomes clear by encountering what it is not, by pushing against limits, and by establishing itself in relation to difficulty. The hero archetype structures this entire process. It turns experience into something that must be faced, something that must be engaged with rather than avoided. Over time, these repeated confrontations accumulate. The ego becomes more stable, more defined, more capable of maintaining a sense of identity across different situations. What begins as fragile and undefined gradually becomes coherent and consistent. But this process does not end in childhood. The hero archetype is not something that finishes its job once the ego forms. It remains active throughout life whenever the individual is pushed beyond their current limits. Every time you encounter something that challenges your identity, your beliefs, your capabilities, or your understanding of yourself, the same pattern re-emerges. This is why growth often feels uncomfortable. It involves stepping into something that is not yet known, not yet mastered, not yet integrated. It involves tension between what you are and what you are becoming. The hero archetype organizes this tension into movement. It pushes the psyche forward into development rather than allowing it to remain static. At a deeper level, this means the ego is not a fixed entity. It is something that is continuously shaped and reshaped through archetypal processes, especially through the pattern of the hero. Every meaningful development, psychological, emotional, or existential, follows this structure of confrontation and transformation. The details may differ, the situations may change, but the underlying pattern remains consistent. The hero does not just help you grow. It is the pattern through which growth becomes possible. A common misunderstanding is that when an archetype becomes active, it somehow takes over the psyche, as if something else steps in, replaces the ego, and begins controlling experience. This idea feels intuitive, especially when emotions are intense or when a person feels not like themselves. But this is not how Carl Jung understood it. The ego does not disappear when an archetype becomes active. It is not pushed out or overridden. Instead, something more subtle and more important happens. The ego begins to express itself through an archetypal pattern. When the hero archetype is constellated, when psychic energy begins flowing strongly through that pattern, the ego remains the center of awareness, but the way it experiences reality shifts. Perception, emotion, and interpretation begin to organize themselves around the structure of the hero. Reality is no longer neutral. It becomes charged with direction. Thoughts begin to take on a certain tone. I have to deal with this. I can't avoid this. This is something I need to overcome. Emotions follow that same pattern: tension, pressure, determination, sometimes fear, but a fear that is tied to movement forward rather than retreat. Behavior becomes oriented toward confrontation, toward effort, toward stepping into something rather than away from it. You don't stop being you, your identity doesn't vanish. Instead, you experience yourself as someone who must face something, overcome something, or become something. This is not a replacement of the ego, it is a structuring of the ego's experience. And this becomes especially clear when you look at dreams. In dreams, the hero archetype often appears in symbolic form. You may find yourself as a protagonist moving through a landscape, facing danger, pursuing something, or being pursued. There may be a journey, a mission, a sense that something must be done. You might encounter obstacles, enemies, unknown spaces, or environments that feel unfamiliar and charged with meaning. At first glance, it can feel like you are watching a story, like these figures are separate from you. But in Jungian terms, this is not the case. These dream figures are not other people acting independently. They are expressions of your own psyche, organizing itself through the hero pattern. The dream is not showing someone else being the hero. It is showing how your ego is currently structured in relation to development. If you are being chased in a dream, it is not just random fear. It may reflect something in your psyche that has not yet been integrated, something that demands confrontation but has not yet been faced. If you are climbing, progressing, or moving upward, it may reflect movement toward growth or differentiation. If you are fighting or overcoming something, it may represent the psyche working through resistance, establishing itself in relation to what is not yet understood or mastered. Even the environment of the dream matters. Unknown spaces, dark areas, or unfamiliar settings often represent areas of the psyche that are not yet conscious, territory that the ego has not fully entered. The hero pattern organizes these spaces as something to be explored, confronted, or moved through. What makes dreams so powerful is that they strip away the illusion that you are separate from these patterns. In waking life, it is easy to think, this is just how I feel, or this is just what I'm dealing with. But in dreams, the structure becomes visible. You can see the pattern directly, even if you don't fully understand it at first. And across all of this, the key point remains. The ego is not replaced by the hero, it is structured by it in that moment. The ego is still the one experiencing, deciding, and moving. But the form that experience takes, the way reality is organized, the way meaning appears, the direction of thought and action is shaped by the archetypal pattern that is active. Understanding this changes how you interpret both your inner life and your dreams. Instead of seeing yourself as randomly reacting to situations, you begin to recognize that your experience is being shaped by deeper patterns. The question is no longer just, what am I feeling? But, through what pattern is my psyche organizing this experience right now? And when the answer is the hero, it means one thing above all. You are being structured toward growth, whether you resist it or not. However, the hero archetype is not something abstract, distant, or theoretical. It is something you can observe directly in your own experience once you know what to look for. It is not hidden in some symbolic layer separate from your life. It is present in the way your experience organizes itself in moments of growth, pressure, and confrontation. The first sign of the hero archetype is not confidence, it is tension paired with direction. You begin to feel a pull towards something that is not easy. At the same time, there is resistance. Part of you wants to avoid it, delay it, or stay where things are comfortable. But another part of you recognizes, almost instinctively, that avoiding it is not an option. There is a sense that something must be faced. It shows up as an internal pressure that has a very specific quality. Not just stress, not just anxiety, but something more structured. I have to deal with this. I can't keep avoiding this. This is something I need to face. And sometimes, alongside that pressure, there is a counter voice, not always loud, but present. You can do this. You're stronger than this. Just step into it. These are not random thoughts. They are expressions of the psyche organizing itself through the hero pattern. The ego is beginning to interpret reality as something that must be engaged with and overcome, rather than avoided. Emotionally, this state is complex. It is not purely positive or negative. It often feels like a mixture of pressure, intensity, and urgency, combined with determination, focus, and forward movement. There is often fear present, but it is a forward-moving fear, not a paralyzing one. It does not push you away from the situation. It exists alongside the movement into it. This is one of the clearest signs that the hero archetype is active. Fear does not stop action, it accompanies it. Another important marker is how situations begin to feel structured. Instead of random events, your experience starts to take on a kind of narrative form. You begin to perceive what you're going through as something to overcome, something to move through, something that has a direction, even if you don't fully understand it yet. However, it is important to distinguish the hero from other patterns that can look similar on the surface. Not all effort is the hero. Repetition, maintenance, or routine, even if they require effort, are not necessarily structured by the hero archetype. The hero specifically involves movement into the unknown, the difficult, or the not yet integrated. If you are simply maintaining what already exists, staying within what is familiar, or repeating established patterns, the hero is not strongly active. The hero appears when something new must be confronted, when your current structure is no longer sufficient and movement beyond it becomes necessary. You can also recognize the hero archetype most clearly in hindsight. When you look back at moments where you changed in a meaningful way, where you overcame something, faced something you didn't think you could handle, or stepped into a situation that forced you to grow, you are looking at moments where the hero pattern was strongly constellated. At the time, those moments may not have felt heroic at all. They may have felt uncomfortable, uncertain, or even overwhelming. But structurally, they followed the same pattern: confrontation, effort, and transformation. This is an important realization. The hero does not always feel like strength. Sometimes it feels like pressure. Sometimes it feels like being pushed. Sometimes it feels like you have no choice but to move forward. But that is precisely how the pattern operates. Recognizing the hero archetype in your life is not about labeling yourself as a hero. It is about becoming aware of when your psyche is organizing experience around growth through confrontation. And once you can see that pattern clearly, you begin to relate to it differently. You no longer experience those moments as random stress or meaningless difficulty. You begin to recognize them for what they are: points where the psyche is structuring you toward becoming something more than you currently are. However, recognizing the hero archetype is only the first step. The deeper task is learning how to relate to it properly. The hero is necessary. Without it, there would be no growth, no differentiation, no movement beyond what is given. It is the pattern that pushes you forward, that forces confrontation, that builds the ego through challenge. But it is not meant to be permanent. If you over-identify with the hero, it becomes distorted. You begin to feel like you must always be pushing, always overcoming, always proving something. Life turns into a constant battle. This is where ego inflation begins, the subtle belief that your role is to dominate every situation, to never step back, to never stop striving. Integration means understanding something simple but important. The hero is a pattern you move through, not an identity you become. There are moments that require confrontation, and there are moments that do not. Part of development is learning to distinguish between real challenge and unnecessary struggle. Not everything is meant to be overcome. Not everything is a test. This means allowing space for stillness, for rest, for non-striving. It means not turning every situation into something you have to fight or push through. The hero moves the psyche forward, but something else must stabilize it. This shift often appears clearly in dreams. The hero may fail. The hero may be overwhelmed. The hero may need help, guidance, or support. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs that the psyche is moving beyond a purely heroic mode, toward balance, toward integration, toward something more complete. The hero is the beginning of development, but it is not the end. Used properly, it allows the ego to form, to grow, and to confront what it must. But true psychological development requires more than constant struggle. It requires learning when to act, when to step back, and how to exist without always needing to overcome something. Archetypes are not identities to live inside. They are structures that guide how you become who you are.